All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Beyond the Headlines, the Fundamentals Driving Recycling Markets. My name is Samantha Gentry, and I am an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before today's speakers, there are a few housekeeping things to go over. Your cameras will remain off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have into the chat or the Q&A section, and we will answer those at some point during or after the presentation. This presentation will be recorded and will be uploaded to Conservation Nebraska's YouTube page within a couple of weeks. So if you missed any part of today's presentation, would like to revisit any part, or share it with others, you will be able to find it there. Following the presentation, we will have a very brief survey that should only take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. If anyone in attendance is interested in speaking with a Conservation Nebraska member regarding conservation issues in Nebraska, or to find out more about what we do, please email info@neconserve.org. Today, we welcome Emily Sanchez, who is the Chief Economist at the Recycled Materials Association, and Dr. Kimberly Carroll Steward, who is the Executive Director of the Nebraska Recycling Council. And with that, I will let them take it away.
Perfect. Thank you, Sam. I'm going to share my screen here real quick. So as Sam mentioned, my name is Kimberly Carroll Steward. I am Executive Director here at Nebraska Recycling Council. We are a statewide, so if you've not kind of been introduced to us or heard of us before, we are a statewide recycling nonprofit with the mission really to, oops, sorry about that, the mission to maximize economic and environmental benefits of resource recovery in the state of Nebraska. And we really envision a future where we reserve all materials for the best and highest use. We are a member-based, sorry, my screen is glitching there. We are a member-based organization, so if you're interested in our work, please reach out to us. We're always happy to have those conversations and would love to invite more folks in our community into our organization. We work in a couple of different areas. So we do advocacy support. We do our own research. We host events, do webinars, as well as provide general technical assistance across communities and across the spectrum of stakeholders. So always reach out to us if you have a question about where material goes or you kind of want to know or be connected to someone else in the state. All these things we're happy to do. And so one last thing before I hand it over to our real expert and the star of the show today. If you need to get in touch with us, I just put our contact information that actually goes to my inbox. So that info is a great way to reach out to me directly. Check out our website, nrcne.org. We are always, again, looking for members. We are donor funded as well. So please reach out to us if you have any interest in recycling or even the more broad picture of sustainable materials management and landfill diversion in the state. You can also find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So at any point, kind of see what we're doing or hear anything. And then my final kind of ask here is I just put our QR code up. We do send out a monthly newsletter. That's a great way to kind of see what's going on across the state, what our partners are doing, some kind of policies that we're following. We try to put a lot of information into that. We also include information on our conference and some other events that we hold throughout the year. So with that, I will hand it over here to Emily and let her get her screen up and shared.
Okay. I did get to practice, so this should go well. The sharing part. All right, can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Awesome. All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. I'm just so happy to be able to engage with you guys and having this conversation and getting a chance to share some of a perspective that I have on navigating what can be a challenging time in terms of deciphering what's real noise, what's real signal, what's really happening in the markets and the economy, and how to kind of get a sense of staying grounded and trying to identify structural trends and the real drivers behind what is happening in the recycled materials industry now and going ahead. As you just heard, I'm an economist for the recycled materials industry. So I'm really spending lots of my days reading about our markets. Up close, they can feel really chaotic. But if you step back far enough, you can actually see that they can sometimes be just surprisingly legible when you get a little bit of distance. And so what I want to do right now is just share, how we can get past those headlines that you're hearing, what's really moving metals, paper, and plastics, and what you might want to watch next. Okay, all right. But first, I think what I do want to do is just make sure to give you just a size on the industry. It is the recycled materials industry is really big. It's a huge economic sector and contributor to the overall economy. There's recycling happening in every state across the U.S. It's very important to many communities. It's all over our country, and together it's a really big sector. Altogether, if you look at just the volumes processed across some of the materials I was able to pull together and put into this aggregated volume, you're looking at more than 130 million metric tons of recycled and recovered materials that get processed in the US every year. About 71 billion together in direct economic activity, and more than 175,000 jobs. So these are all they're pretty big numbers when you look at the industry altogether. And it's really it's not a side activity at all. This industry it's a major manufacturing supply sector. And if you look at across the mix here, you can see the table here with the breakdown across some of the types of materials. Iron and steel, which is a lot of times called just ferrous, and also paper, they really are doing the heavy lifting in terms of the volume and the tonnage of what kind of recycled materials are processed every year in the US. If you look at aluminum and copper, they're also really meaningful, especially so, maybe less so in terms of the actual weight and volume tonnage, but in their value. And then looking at plastics too, especially post-consumer, it's a smaller slice of in terms of volume in what gets recycled and processed here in the US. So just wanted to give you that quick background, kind of think about that mix. Just keep that in mind when I'm talking about things, because each of these different commodity markets has different dynamics, different things that are pushing availability and generation and demand for those materials and usages, and also in terms of how those dynamics are emerging as well. And then another thing I just wanted to share, just to get us off with kind of some basis information, is that in terms of the overall scope of what gets recycled and processed in the US, a lot of it doesn't touch that curbside bin. And that is important to keep in mind, because a lot of folks think about recycling as happening they think about it from the direct consumer or household side, or on the street when you're seeing that blue bin at the curb and you see the sign recycling. That's what a lot of people are thinking about. But actually, our understanding that is a little over 2/3, like 70% of the recycled volume in the US is coming from industrial and commercial sources. So not the residential sources. Things like manufacturing offcuts, construction debris, end-of-life equipment, things like that. So we have to keep in mind the breakout of where recycled commodities are coming from. In fact, industrial and commercial are really generating almost twice what residential programs do combined. So let's just keep our aperture wide, I guess. Think about, of course, the residential bin is real, but it's a relatively smaller scope within the big picture of what is the volume of what's processed in the US. So I just started with ReMA only a year ago, and before that, I was working with manufacturers for over 2 decades, but they were in a different industry. And a really cool thing, well, okay, so a really cool thing that I have learned about the industry, and maybe you guys already know this, but something that's been really fascinating to me is I like to ask people their stories. So as I'm meeting ReMA members and folks at the events and stuff like that, I like to ask them, like, how did you get into this? Like, where did this start? And I kept finding, like, kept piling up and stacking these stories about people that will say, like, oh, I'm fifth generation. My family's been doing this since like late 1800s. My grandpa came from Germany and did this or that and started out with a cart and a horse. Like these most fascinating stories, but I kept seeing this theme of a long-term engagement and participation in the recycled materials industry. It's really been awesome and surprising to me. But as I'm looking at the data and sometimes still feeling like an outsider with all these questions, I'm looking at numbers, I'm looking at prices and volume changes and all the headlines and stuff like that. And I ask some of my members, like, how did you last this long? There's this cycle, the swings and the up and downs and the volatility in the industry. Like, how did these companies last so long and not have a heart attack at some point? And it got me to thinking about this theme there too, about resilience, planning ahead, looking at the structural drivers, and understanding what's gonna staying close to your values and keeping in mind what you want to be doing going forward in the future too. So as an economist, what I'm doing when I'm hearing and reading these crazy headlines about I mean, a lot of negative news, honestly, volatility, swings, closures, capacity pullbacks, things like that, and challenges and barriers. A lot of news is really successful news is really designed to pull in readers with fear-based stuff, negative headlines, readers and listeners and participants. But I think we can actually be more rationally optimistic, especially about this industry. And we don't have to feel like the economy and the market is falling apart at the seams. How do I do that? How do I keep that approach? Like, how do I understand and be able to report on what's really happening in the recycled materials industry and where I think we're heading? I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I had one. I don't have one. But what I do is when things are feeling like they're getting really sick, really noisy, I just revert back to my training. I find grounding in math, clarity from economics, and I really feel like the most durable tools I have for having the right lens to look at the recycled materials markets is referring to putting it back on the basis of the laws of supply and demand. So starting with the basics and then building it out, starting with something simple and then layering in the forces that are going to push supply and demand for recycled materials in different directions. So that can be things that are changing consumer preferences, things that are policies that are put in place and actually become active, threats of policies or hopes of policies. Those can have a big impact on shifting around how a market operates. But also there's a lot that goes into how recyclers need to operate their businesses and the costs that they face. Logistics, energy, all kinds of stuff. I'll get into a little bit of that here and there, but these are the kind of things I just try to get back to those basics, find comfort in it, find where I'm seeing supply and demand meeting, and that moment of balance there, and then how those headlines are swinging around it. Whoopsies. All right. So what I want to do is look at this through the right structure and we can stay optimistic about our industry. There we go. All right. So the way recycling is really demand driven. Recycling happens, materials moving when the value around it is working out within that framework that I was just talking about with supply and demand. And here's a way to really think about what makes recycling actually work. I can break it down into four main pieces. Of course, there's other dynamics, but let's just do four for today. Look at demand and markets. Look at the infrastructure there for recycling, capacity to consume, things like that. Technology. This could be process technology. It could even be technology related to some operations and administration. But what's happening with technology, what's changing there? And of course, like I mentioned, the value of that material, and that value, it's in the eye of the beholder, but really you have to look at end use demand, end use markets and applications for the materials to understand how that market is going to be surviving or thriving. So if you notice what I've got on the screen there, like notice where it starts and where it ends. Starts with demand and it ends with value. And you need a net positive value to run your recycling business. So it's really, in some ways, you can kind of say this is like the whole thing in one picture. The first basic, you've got the recycling. Recycling isn't where material is going to go to be thrown away. It's really the front end of a manufacturing supply chain. Their inputs, feedstocks, recycled materials are feedstocks into manufacturing. And they're going to move when mills, smelters, factories are buying the materials to make something. You need all of this in the equation to have successful recycling business, and to do recycling at scale, which is something I want to see maintained and growing in the US and across the world. So one way to read the recycled materials markets is to watch the buyers. That's where you can see where some fundamentals are. So, as I mentioned, the buyers, they are the real end use industries. That's where demand is actually living. And you can make demand, you can think of it in a more concrete way, because it's not abstract really at all. You've got material coming into be recycled really in three ways. Residential, you can see end of life, like from cars, building materials, and things like that. And then the cleaner prompt scrap is what it's called a lot. But there's like factory offcuts, things that may be coming right off of the line. Sometimes they're cycled right back into their manufacturing process. Sometimes they're collected and sent somewhere else to an entity that can do something meaningful with it. But where the recyclers are coming in there is, they're collecting, sorting, cleaning, and processing that material. And then they're selling it back into real end use industries. So auto manufacturing, steel mills, metal producers, construction, and infrastructure, packaging, appliances, you name it. So when I'm saying to keep an eye on demand to understand how the economics of the recycling markets, what I mean is like, keep an eye on those industries that are going to be consuming these materials as feedstocks. When they're active and they're buying and consuming, that's when you're going to be seeing recycled materials moving. When they're pulling back, when they're having softer activity, or they've have reduced capacity, or something is blocking their ability to continue, that's when you're going to see things change in terms of recycled materials moving. So this is kind of like my roadmap. Layer those forces in one at a time. Now I'm just kind of jumping from another angle here too. And this is about the consumer, and we have to think about the consumer a lot. The consumer is very much involved in terms of what's generated, what they decide to do with packaging and other materials when they're finished using them. What is their situation? What's the labor market? What's their spending behavior? Like, all of those kind of things are something we want to watch when we're trying to understand what's happening, not only with what type of material is being generated and collected, but also what demand is going to be like in terms of those companies that would have been doing something with the recycled product. So packaging, especially auto manufacturing. So a lot of those industries that I just mentioned. So this picture here is I asked ChatGPT to help me out make a picture of myself. So that's myself. I'm a mom. I have 4 kids. That's my youngest kid, Felix. He's 10. He absolutely loves hot Cheetos. And so I've been reading a lot about how American consumers in particular are have been trading down, and how they've been changing their behavior a bit there. And it made me think about how I wouldn't be able to do that with my Felix. Like, there's no way he's taking a generic brand of hot Cheetos. His demand for hot Cheetos is real and it's very inelastic. But I'm just bringing this up to share that I think when we're hearing things about the consumer, we want to make sure that we're looking beyond just the average and those big headlines that we're hearing about their spending changing, their sentiment being different, things like that. We want to look past the headlines, what they're reporting, that one single statistic, and think about like what's really happening below the surface here. And when we do that, you can really see a picture change. So again, if you just look at the consumer, you hear so much about headlines being about like stress and squeezed budgets and low confidence and things like that. But honestly, when you actually look and when you're objective and look at the actual data, you see that people are still buying. There's really been this kind of separation between the trends on consumer sentiment, how they're saying they feel, and what they're actually doing. So consumers are still buying. There's demand there, but something is changing. Private label grocery sales, they hit a huge point last year. They're growing a lot faster than national brands, and that goes back to my trading down to generic if you can. Folks are working with the budgets they have, but they are still spending. They're not buying less. They're trading down. They're buying the generic hot Cheetos if they can. Either way, well, I think about in this example about the consumer is a name brand water bottle versus a generic brand water bottle. I'm pretty sure it's just about the same volume consumed in terms of plastics, resins, packaging. So, and from my perspective, wondering how this is impacting the recycled materials market, and particularly like the resins, what I just mentioned, I'm still seeing volumes flowing through, regardless of the label on the bag. So stress demand, yeah, but more like an adapted demand in terms of demand for things that can eventually be recycled. And adapted demand is still demand. So that's one way to kind of look beyond the average and headlines to understand a little bit about what's going on in an area that's important in terms of generation and demand for recycled materials. Another area is in building and construction. And you really do absolutely need to look below the headlines for this one. And my next slide shows a really interesting chart related to this, but I'll just say, I think the headlines are often, they're about housing, rates are still high, permits related to construction of housing, they're soft, single family homes are still, sales are still weak. But if you look beyond just the residential information, which does get a lot of the headlines, that's what people are going to understand and be interested in residential information. If you look beyond that, what's actually happening in building construction, which, if I didn't already say this, is a massive source of demand for recycled material feedstock. What's really going on within the industry is a story about bright spots. There's weak spots and bright spots, but the building construction industry remains a pretty solid source of demand for our materials. We've got non-residential construction starts up 53% when I checked a few months ago with the data. There is a lot of building and construction in terms of infrastructure pipeline that's I mean, it's already in the books, and a lot of the products that they're going to need cannot be made without scrap and recycled material input. So that's a massive source of demand that your headlines aren't going to tell you about. And then, of course, there's also the data centers, power and grid, semiconductor fabs, public infrastructure, like I said. Of course, there's soft spots too, like office and retail, but there are some categories that are really actually pulling up the headline. And those are going to be the categories that are pulling up demand for recycled input. Just a quick view on that. And this is just a look at some pretty dramatic information related to building and construction if you were to break it out by subsector, some data reflecting what happened last year. And you can see there's growth that's really concentrated in some single areas. You've got a few sectors that are growing, fabricated metal, data centers, like I said, power and energy, and then all the traditional building and construction sectors are a lot weaker in comparison. But then turn back to the data center line, and you can see it's like nearly vertical since 2023. One hyperscale facility can take about 20,000 tons of steel. I'll talk about steel for a minute in a little bit, but I'll tell you again. But in the U.S. we make steel largely with recycled steel inputs, so it's a huge source of demand there. So for recycled material in particular, this is a demand picture on one, really on one slide. The growth, you can see it's really concentrated, is not broad-based at all, but it is real. So I think probably the thing, if you're watching this particular source of demand, what you want to be watching though is power, whether or not the grid's going to keep up, whether it's going to slow things down, but you could have a pause or deceleration or something like that in the coming year or so, but this is a longer term trajectory. Now, whoopsies. Let's see if we can go back. There we go. All right. All right. So another thing I want to talk about that's super important to recycled materials businesses are the people who are involved. And you can, as an economist, you could think of it as, like put it down as labor. Think about it as the labor factor. It's really important to whether or not some materials end up being economically recyclable, where they can be recycled, how, things like that. So thinking about the skills and the type of work that you need, whether you have that aligned or mismatched, where you need the work to happen. Those things all are very important to the economics of recycling and running those businesses. So you can think of that as like a cost. Collecting and sorting is really hard work. It's hands-on work. And I think at the same time, you can look at that as some of those more labor-intensive steps as actually being something that recycling businesses are going to think of as they take that on as cost pressure. And that cost pressure on their bottom line and on their ability to be profitable or not and invest or not, those kind of cost pressures are something that are actually what's going to drive ingenuity, innovation, R&D, thinking about new things, new ways to handle stuff in more efficient ways. It's very awesome to see what recyclers come up with in terms of creativity and finding better ways to do things. So, in the people here, what you're seeing is, they're spending time and effort towards basically engineering their spread to keep their businesses doing well. On one side, you've got and in the science, you're thinking about optical, AI sorting, metallurgy that upgrades a grade. These things are so important in terms of being able to deliver deliver a product that it's worth more, that is easier to handle. There's all kinds of things that you can do by applying science here. And then, of course, in terms of technology, recyclers are going to want to try to densify their loads, get smarter routing so that they can, not have freight stops eating up their margin. They're going to be thinking about all kinds of tech-wise and process-wise, what they can do to be running their businesses more efficiently. And then, of course, there's the art, the grader's eye. There is actually, there are people that can. I didn't know this. Maybe you guys know this. People can smell metals. They can look at things. They can look at something that's like a mixture of things. They can look at it and they know what they know about the chemical composition. They know about the processes that would be involved, the cost that would be involved to extract something valuable from the material that they're looking at. These recyclers, they're amazing. These graders are able to look at things and have a good sense of what they're looking at there and whether the economics, the math are going to work out to move forward with certain material processing. So the people working in the industry, they're measuring everything. They're looking at tons per hour, throughput, energy per ton. They're thinking about so many things to be able to try to work on that spread, to be able to make sure that they've got the margin and a profit to be able to continue operating and invest in the future. So I think the big idea here is just really that what counts as recyclable it's not going to just be fixed by chemistry alone. It's going to be set by economics. So you can always look at economics to understand what's happening there. And I think that, as I mentioned earlier, when you're looking at the supply and demand curves, these are lines that can be pushed around. And that's what recyclers are trying to do. They're going to be trying to move around their costs and other things so that they can have a more profitable business and stay in business. So, basically trying to get that stream that, maybe they have a stream of material coming out of their shredder or something like that. Maybe the math isn't penciling out today, but they can be doing research and development to be figuring out how can they recycle something tomorrow, and figure that part out to get that edge. So I've talked a lot about U.S. based, but the recycled materials industry it's a global industry, and being able to export. Let's see if I can get the rest of these charts here. Okay, being able to export products and get material to where they can be used and there's capacity to process them and consume them is so important to recyclers being able to stay in business. A lot of recyclers are dealing with not just as, I talked about the different sources of where recyclable materials can come from, with like industrial prompt scrap being one of like the cleanest, easiest, most understood grades. But then you can have in other situations where you're dealing with a basket of things, or maybe you're shredding products as part of your process, and you have a lot of different things coming out there. And there may be one particular material within your output that is going to be driving your business right now, and you want to always be trying to figure out your numbers and your business so that you can keep moving forward. You may have something that's coming out, there's not demand for it here, but in India or Germany or Mexico or somewhere else, they can do something with it. They have the capacity, whether it's capital or labor, to do something with it, make something meaningful. So exports, and having market access, having access to external customers is so important to the recycled materials industry. And can often those exports are often serving as a relief valve for recyclers to be able to make their current mix profitable. And overall, I think, so I've got a layout here of some different categories of materials. So different categories are going to be more dependent, more export intensive than others. So this can change though. It depends on what's going on in external markets, and things can change within the US as well in terms of maybe a stronger domestic demand pull coming in with competing with external markets and things like that. So it can fluctuate, but the point I want to make here is how important it is to be able to export for recyclers, and it does comprise a large part of the volume that's sorted, processed. We want to see material flows to where the demand is for cleaner grades. That's everywhere pretty much. For some of those mixed, harder to use fractions, the best market might be, like I said, simply a broad relief valve, but it's a sale. Let's see. And I just wanted to mention another industry that we want to track in terms of where materials can find value and where they're important. And I like to use auto and transportation is just super important end use sector. But I like to talk about vehicles to folks because a lot of us don't realize how embedded recycled materials are in the products that we need to be able to make autos around the world and in the US. And if you take that vehicle, you've got, cars have steel, aluminum, copper, nickel, stainless steel, resins, rubber, electronics, all kinds of stuff that not only can be created and designed with recycling in mind, so created in the first place with recycled input, but then when a car reaches its end of life, understanding the materials and material composition within that car is super important because those materials can then be kept in a loop, used again to make more autos or whatever other product it could be useful in. So an end-of-life vehicle is important to think about because it's giving recyclers many commodity streams, and all of those materials, I want to see them find their home. In terms of big long-term buyers of materials, if I just focused on aluminum for a second, let's see if I have a slide on it. I don't, so I'll just mention this for a sec. When I think about aluminum, which is going into auto, it's also really important for building and construction infrastructure, transportation. These big sectors are really important, and this is where it can kind of be fun when you're thinking about how different economies are developing, where they are in economically, what stage they are in. Are they developing? Are they mature, developed? Country like the US is, for example, or in other countries you have like India, you have a lot happening, a lot of investment happening in infrastructure and within that economy, and the consumers living there growing wealthier and being able to afford cars and packaging and all kinds of stuff, catching up in terms of maturity economy-wise. And the countries in different earlier stage of development don't already have what a country like US has in place. So they need materials now for their roads, buildings, grids, things like that. So what they're building today won't become recyclable for decades even. And we can think about that dynamic too when we're thinking about cars, how long they are expected to last, what they're composed of, what we think we're going to be dealing with when they get to the recycler in terms of composition of what's coming out of it. Let's see. And I want to share just on a couple of different markets here. One on plastics in particular, which is a really important one to think about a little differently. I think, I see with resins, there being a really challenging kind of almost two-speed market here. We can't really think about plastics as just one thing. it makes more sense to be thinking about when you're thinking recycling, thinking about the split across the resins. If you are watching the headlines, you are hearing a lot about PET, for example, being in crisis, and a lot of those headlines are real. We've got domestic reclaimers shutting under import pressure, things like that. And then at the same time, polyethylene, polypropylene products firming and demand actually outpacing feedstock. Still seeing challenges in film. On the other side, though, so a lot of that's on that demand side, but on the other side, generation of these materials at the end of their use is steady. If you think about that consumer, like I was saying earlier, even with economic, demographic changes, we're still seeing a lot of the consumption continue. Even if there's trade down and things like that, you're still dealing with the volume of material that could be recycled. So we've got a mismatch here a bit on the demand and supply side for some of these resins. And so that's an important thing to think about when you're thinking about how does recycling work within the resin industry in general, and what kind of forces would you need to layer in on the supply or demand side, whether it's policy, increased education. What would you need to be able to make that balance for that market, for plastics recyclers to be able to do what they're doing and stay in business and thrive? I think with resins, you can often find that collecting isn't going to be just enough. You need more education, and you need to have that demand there firming. And see, real quick, just on some of the non-ferrous areas. Really, it is, especially, there's been a lot of success. There's a longer history, strong demand, big energy advantage in terms of non-ferrous like aluminum, copper, stainless steel. They're really kind of on the other end in terms of the spectrum, more of success stories there. And I love it. Like aluminum in the US is when you're recycling it and using these materials, you're using 95% less energy than primary. So you can sell this to somebody who cares about the environment and energy, or you can sell it to someone just trying to get their economics and math work to get their businesses to be able to operate successfully when you're thinking about energy costs as being so important to recycling businesses. And then the copper, the demand for recycled copper is just at historic highs. It's really important in terms of EVs, data centers, the grid. Super important. Stainless. We are definitely needing that for steady mills running, things like that. There's a lot going on, especially in the building, construction, auto sectors, where there's steady enough demand for those sectors. Let's see. I think I'd bring up the non-ferrous side just to share. I think this is a good intersection where you can see a lot of where you might be able to find values kind of lining up with economics, pointing the same way, where the energy savings are a cost advantage. So you can have both in this story. And then wanted to give a quick look also on steel and ferrous and decarbonization there, because I'm not sure how aware, how broadly understood it is how important recycled steel and recycled inputs are into making steel in the U.S. Steel, I think, really deserves its own beat for that reason, just because of how we make it in the U.S. compared to how it's made in other parts of the world. In the U.S., about 72% of steel's made in electric arc furnaces. So essentially just remelting recycled steel absolutely needs recycled input to do what it does. So it's got a far lower carbon than ore and coal routes. Globally, the rate on the rate for EAF shares, recycled steel input usage to make steel, is closer to like 29%. So I think U.S. has really been solid in terms of moving into creating steel in a less carbon intensive way. I think that's awesome. And I also love seeing when you look at the trends across the different countries, you can see that every major steel economy is really moving in that same direction, even if they're definitely moving in different paces. But I'm seeing for sure not just a headline about decarbonization that within steel production, there's really a structural tailwind there in terms of the trend. And the world's shifting to EAF processes, and demand for recycled steel is going to grow with that. And then one more quick point here, just related to lower having recycled materials having them being so central to a lower carbon future. And I just love that. I feel like the economics really agree here. If you step back on things and take a look at these sectors, I think it all really adds up. Especially when you're looking at recycled steel, you're preventing a really massive amount of emissions into the environment every year worldwide. So doing it, having the processes in place, using recycled inputs, it's cutting emissions, it's saving energy. And as I mentioned earlier, carbon markets, customer demand, just plain economics, they're all pushing in that same direction. Recycled materials don't need to be seen just as an industrial input in this story. They're central to lower carbon future of and how the world is going to be making metal. Finally, let me wrap it up, and I hope we have a chance to talk. I know I've talked a lot already, but I would say, just when you're hearing different headlines, when you're thinking about what's actually going to be moving your material, even if it's no matter where it's being sourced, what's actually going to give that material a market so that it can go to being used again, being used as long as it can, and preventing other methods that would be more carbon intensive and things like that. We want to try to watch the signals that are slower. What's happening structurally? Where are we moving towards? If we want to understand what's happening in the markets, you can look at things like manufacturing surveys and indicators. You can get a pulse there. You can look at buildings to starts, information to understand metal that's going into construction. You can look at some of the industrial production numbers like what I showed on a slide earlier. And then, of course, also understanding trade and development trends for that global pool, what's happening, what countries are expanding, where do we want to make sure we're still able to export towards, because we're generating something, we don't have the capacity or demand to use it, but somebody else does somewhere else. How do we make sure that market access is still there? So I think where to understand the markets and what's happening, you don't want to just wait and listen to the volatility and the noise and stuff. You want to be looking at what would be there when the noise clears. Where do you want to be? Recyclers need to understand where do they want to be positioned longer terms. So I hope that I've talked enough about some of those fundamentals. There's a lot to think about when you're looking at the market. Obviously couldn't cover it all today, but I hope this gives you a little perspective on the kind of things that I'm thinking about for some of the major recycled commodities. And I want to turn it back to, I guess, Kimberly, to see if you guys have any questions, any thoughts on anything, any feedback. Are you seeing something that doesn't make sense or wondering about something more? Maybe I have an answer, or ReMA does. And because I would just really love to keep our conversation going. So thanks for having me here. And I guess let's talk.
Thank you. Yeah, and before we get started with questions, I'm going to launch the survey.
Okay.
If everyone watching could fill it out, it's just 4 quick questions. All right. And then also we did have a question in the chat already. It is what are UBC items?
Oh, UBC stands for used beverage cans or containers. And I could talk a little bit more about that. But that's what it stands for.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, they're highly valuable. They're an important, highly valuable area to look in terms of recycled materials because they're very well. Of course, we're drinking stuff all that we generate a lot of it, but they we it's easy for recyclers to understand. They know what they're getting at when they're getting a bale of UBCs. They understand the chemistry involved. They understand the metal. It's considered it's a higher grade or cleaner type of material because of the understanding around it and how easily it can get remelted back and used because you know what you're getting. So knowledge around the material and knowledge about at a technical level what you could do with it, depending on the specifications around it, really helps to move the material better. It helps to connect where that material is gathered. It helps to connect back to someone that can actually use it and do something important with it.
Okay, thank you. And then one question I had, maybe just to clarify. So on your first slide, you talked about how 70% of recycled materials are from like industrial or commercial. I guess where do you see the most opportunity or like what industries have like the highest amount?
Oh, like so volume wise?
Yeah, like I know because you mentioned non-residential construction. Is that kind of
Yeah.
what you would identify as like the
Yeah. So I mean I guess if you wanted to take it back a notch, there's so much that's coming out in terms of ferrous or steel output. And like that could be coming from a car, a big truck. It could be coming from construction and demolition. When we're taking down a bridge and making a new one or whatever. In the U.S., because we're more developed and moved along, we when and we've churned that a newly developing economy doesn't quite have yet. We have a lot of future recyclable materials that are in place. So as like I said, like if you're doing construction and demolition or putting in something, repairing things, these materials are generated and able to be recycled and reused again. And especially in metals, um, it's a developed, understood process that has been around for a really long time. I just One thing I've kind of noticed is people call in the U.S. we just talk about steel. We don't usually say recycled steel, like unless we're having a conversation like how you and I would. But a lot of people don't realize how awesome we're already doing, I guess, in terms of getting stuff that's generated at a huge volume and not letting it go to waste. So I don't know if that's where you were going, what you were wondering about.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Another question we have is what are the biggest challenges with recycling of plastic film? Are you talking about LDPE, HDPE, LLDPE?
hmm so I don't know. Kimberly, do you have any background on that? I have an answer, but I'm not a technical expert whatsoever. I would just at a really high level. I know some of the challenges are like, imagine like you're getting this stuff coming in at bulk, and you need to have the capital and equipment that can process it well and not get jammed up. You need things to not be contaminated, so that could be like that film having like grease or something all over it, or maybe something weird from it was thrown into a bin with something else. I think there's a lot of challenges that can come with that material just because of physically how it's shaped and its flexibility and stuff like that. But please don't. So that's just my high level. I think it comes down to processing, and then also a huge thing not to forget to keep in mind would be for materials and you're deciding what to do with it. When you're thinking supply and demand, you have to think about substitutability or alternatives. So with plastics, you're always competing with the virgin.
Yeah.
So if you think about everything going on, and both the recycling process for the recyclables versus the virgin, they're both using energy. Like they both have a lot of costs to like actually run and produce these products. But you have to look at the input cost and things like that. And in the US, virgin resins are very much advantaged in terms of feedstock and energy costs. So, and probably some other things, regulatory or whatever. It's a tough market for some resins, and it's hard to get. You have to get the math to work um, to be able to produce something that would be competitive against a something you made with a primary resin. Does that make sense? I work with a bunch of experts, by the way. And I hope I just hope we can keep in touch because I work with super smart people that know so much at the technical level, not just about the composition of the materials, but also about the processes, how things are advancing and changing, the challenges and barriers, not just at the national level, but at the states. Each state has can have really different dynamics in terms of recycling, collection infrastructure in itself. Laws and policies, regulations, how businesses can operate, whether they can get permitted or not. Like, are they gonna set something up on one side of the river or the other side because that state has different setup for a business to run. There's so much that goes into whether or not the recycler can run a business well, stay in business, be strong enough and steady enough to get through the cycles that are related with commodities, the up and down and the pricing and things like that. They have to be able to get through that. They have to be able to think longer term and connect to those longer term trends in terms of saving energy, reducing emissions, decarbonization, things like that. They have to think longer term. Connects back to me meeting all these people that have been doing it for so long. It's the coolest thing. People that have had families just busting their butts for more than a century, some of them, doing the right thing and making the math work. That's what I think, anyway.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So another question is it worth putting the number 3 through number 7 plastics in our recycle bins? There appears to be zero demand for them in the market.
I think part of it's that's like was like your own morals or ethic. I don't know. That's a hard question. Like if you know, I would break it down to get information. Where am I? What's going to happen with it? I think you said in the question they know they won't do anything with it. If you knew if it's getting collected and it's going somewhere and you have been educated to know they can't do anything with it or that they won't. I don't know if you have an alternative thing you might want to do with it, or you may also think kind of have like a net benefit, net cost approach. Sometimes if you're putting something in there and you may be making it more costly to process and sort through and make valuable the other stuff that's in that bin. Because now there's some stuff in there that needs to get pushed out of the way. Almost like, I think they call it contaminants sometimes when you have some stuff in your load that isn't what you were hoping to have there. It reduces the value, increases the cost to sort, collect, process, all that kind of stuff. So I don't have a definitive answer on that. I think I would just think like, if they tell you that they can't do anything with it, I might consider it as kind of a negative to put it in there, but I'm probably not supposed to be quoted on anything like that. And also I think, sorry for going on a tangent here now, but also add what's it called, like green wishing?
Greenwashing.
Greenwashing.
Yep.
No, not washing. It's
Oh,
wish.
wish cycling.
Oh, wishing,
Yeah,
wish
yeah, yeah.
cycling.
Like, yeah. So not good. No, like when it's so bad. Like all of us, we learned something that's like, oh my gosh, I was putting it in that, like hoping they'd do something with it, and now I know more, and I can't go back in time. Yeah, but we got to educate ourselves, and then and then share what we find out, and a lot of that knowledge has to it's locally anchored, like it depends on your local conditions. I didn't mention one of the million things to consider in the economics of recycling is like, where are you? How close are you to demand? Are you down the river from a mill? Are you close to a port? Um, are you in Nebraska? I don't know what the rail lines are like, but you could maybe go both directions. But if you're on West Coast, it could be cheaper for you to find a market in Asia instead of getting to a mill in Southeast US. All of those costs stack up. So,
Thank you. And then I think this is the last question we have. It seems like we focus on residential much more than industry when it comes to recycling. One obvious reason would be residents have direct involvement with residential recycling. Is the industrial stream cleaner? We would think that the stream consists of less variables than what comes from a community. Why do we ignore it so often when it is such a large portion of overall waste generation?
I'm so sorry, no, we don't have much time, but I couldn't hear part. Were you saying why do we ignore residential or
Or
commercial?
why do we focus so much more on residential? Is it because the industry stream is cleaner? And then why do we ignore it when in the industry side is so much more volume?
I don't know that. Like, and I can say personally, before became I know a little bit more now than I did about recycling and all that compared to when I was younger. And it is true that we learn so much about the residential side and our own personal actions and choices. Um, Maybe it's because it's where we know we can make a direct impact, an acute, extremely direct impact, and maybe it helps us to be more conscious. And it's smaller than the commercial industrial, but it is still massive. There's a lot that's moving to landfills. It'd be awesome if it didn't have to. Whether you look at that as being right or wrong or just cost related. Um, so I'm not sure. That's a really good question. I would love to know what the person who asked that thinks.
Perfect, thank you. It looks like that's all of the questions. So that concludes our webinar. If you haven't gotten a chance to fill out the survey that was launched, we would greatly appreciate it if you took the time to fill that out. If you want to share this presentation with someone who wasn't able to attend or want to watch it again, the webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel in the near future with all of our past webinars. Thank you so much for attending the webinar and supporting local conservation efforts. Most importantly, thank you to Emily Sanchez and Dr. Carroll Steward for presenting and sharing your time and talent. Have a great day.